The cold metal of the cuffs bit into Elijah Carter's wrists as he was slammed against his own luxury car. "You fit the description," the cop sneered, ignoring his protests. Bystanders filmed in shock, but no one stepped in. What the officer didn't know? Elijah had an army of top lawyers ready to destroy him. And when they arrived, everything changed. But let's start from the beginning. Elijah Carter stepped out of his sleek black Tesla, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit. He had just wrapped up an intense executive board meeting, finalizing a multi-million-dollar merger that would propel his tech company to new heights. His mind was still occupied with the details: stock projections, legal clauses, investor expectations. The deal had taken months to negotiate, but it was done. This was supposed to be a good day. The moment his polished shoes touched the pavement, red and blue lights flared behind him, flashing off the glassy high-rise buildings around him. A sharp voice sliced through the city's ambient noise. "Sir, hands on the car!" Elijah turned, his brow furrowing as Officer Darren McCall approached with quick, forceful strides. The cop's left hand rested on his holstered weapon, his right already reaching for Elijah's arm. Elijah's pulse spiked, but he kept his composure. "Is there a problem, officer?" McCall didn't answer. He grabbed Elijah's wrist and spun him around, shoving him against the smooth, reflective surface of the Tesla. The impact rattled through his chest. His hands splayed on the hood, his heart hammering, confusion tightening his throat. "You fit the description of a suspect involved in a robbery nearby," McCall said, yanking one of Elijah's arms behind his back. Elijah clenched his jaw. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. "I'm a CEO," he said, his voice level despite the rage creeping in. "I just left a business meeting." "Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England." McCall's sneer curled his lip as he snapped the first cuff onto Elijah's wrist with an unnecessary amount of force. Pain shot through his arm, but Elijah refused to flinch. He could feel the weight of eyes on him now. Pedestrians had stopped, murmuring amongst themselves. A few had pulled out their phones, recording. "Officer, this is a mistake." Elijah tried again, his voice edged with controlled urgency. "Check my ID. Call my office. I can prove exactly where I was." McCall ignored him, securing the second cuff and yanking Elijah upright. "Save it." A woman in a business suit hesitated nearby, her phone raised. "That's Elijah Carter," she murmured, as if saying it aloud would make this situation make sense. McCall's head snapped toward her. "Step back." The woman hesitated, glancing between Elijah and the officer. Elijah took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Officer, this is going to be a serious mistake on your part." McCall smirked. "Oh, is that right?" He started patting Elijah down with rough, calculated movements, his hands shoving against his pockets, his belt, his jacket. The humiliation sank in. He was being searched like a common criminal, right there on the sidewalk in broad daylight. "You got weapons? Drugs?" McCall asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Elijah's hands curled into fists, restrained by the metal cutting into his wrists. "My wallet is in my jacket. Take it out and check my ID." McCall did, flipping through the expensive leather wallet like it was a cheap trinket. He pulled out Elijah's license, his brows knitting together as he read the name. His sneer faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. "That's supposed to impress me?" McCall tossed the wallet onto the car's hood. People lie about who they are all the time. Elijah's patience thinned to a dangerous thread. "Look at the address. Look at my business card. Call my office. Check the security footage from the Carlton Hotel. I was in a meeting there the entire morning." McCall tilted his head, pretending to consider it. Then he grinned. "I think I'd rather take you in and sort it out later." A sick, sinking feeling settled in Elijah's stomach. He could fight this. He had resources, power, influence. But in this moment, with his hands bound, a badge against him, and an officer who had already decided his guilt, none of that mattered. The crowd grew. A man whispered, That's not right. Another voice, female, cut in, stronger. Are you really arresting Elijah Carter? McCall's jaw twitched, his annoyance breaking through. Everyone back up. His hand hovered near his taser. This is police business. Elijah stared at him, eyes cold. You don't even believe I'm guilty. You just don't want to admit you screwed up. McCall's nostrils flared. He tightened his grip on Elijah's arm and pulled him toward the waiting squad car. Watch your head. The door slammed shut behind him. Inside the vehicle, Elijah's breath was steady, but his mind was racing. His assistant had seen everything. His legal team would be mobilized in minutes. He wouldn't sit in a holding cell long. But McCall had no idea who he had just tried to play power games with. The mistake he just made, it would cost him everything. Slammed into the back of a squad car, Elijah Carter's breath came slow and measured, but his mind raced. The scent of cheap vinyl and stale sweat filled the confined space, pressing in on him as the cruiser pulled away from the curb. Outside, bystanders watched in disbelief, their phones still raised, capturing the moment. He had worked his entire life for this, for respect, for security, for power. And now, in front of cameras, in front of an entire city, he was reduced to just another suspect. McCall sat in the front seat, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel, smug satisfaction radiating off him. What's the matter, CEO? He called over his shoulder. Not used to being treated like the rest of us? Elijah didn't answer. He could feel the weight of the handcuffs digging into his wrists, cutting into his skin every time the car hit a bump. The injustice of it burned. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had been in this position before, without resources, without cameras, without a voice. By the time they reached the station, his jaw was clenched so tightly his teeth ached. The doors swung open and McCall yanked him out, shoving him toward the entrance. Officers barely glanced their way as they stepped inside, moving through the fluorescent-lit corridors that smelled of disinfectant and sweat. McCall stopped at the processing desk, pulling out Elijah's wallet and tossing it onto the counter like it was trash. His ID landed face up, the laminated card reflecting the dull overhead lighting. The officer behind the desk, a tired-looking man with graying hair, picked it up, glancing between the photo and Elijah's face. His brows furrowed. Elijah Carter, the man read aloud, his voice carrying a note of recognition. He lifted his gaze. You're that tech guy, right? Yeah, and I bet he stole every dime of it, McCall sneered before Elijah could respond. He leaned against the desk, smirking as if this was all a game to him. Elijah's muscles tensed. Check the security footage, he said, his voice controlled but sharp. I was at the Carlton Hotel boardroom the entire time. McCall chuckled, a low, condescending sound. Oh, don't worry. We'll investigate. He turned to the desk officer. Go ahead and process him. Until we sort things out, our big-shot CEO here can sit tight. The desk officer hesitated, shifting his weight. If he's got an alibi. McCall cut him off with a pointed look. He fits the description. Silence stretched between them. The older officer exhaled through his nose, then motioned for Elijah's fingerprints. No one wanted to challenge McCall outright. Not yet. Elijah let them take the prints, let them snap his mugshot, let them check every box in their slow, deliberate process. He knew the game. The longer they kept him here, the more power McCall got to wield over him. This wasn't about justice. It was about control. Finally, McCall jerked his chin toward the hallway. Take him to holding. A younger officer, barely out of the academy by the look of him, grabbed Elijah's arm, leading him toward the row of cells in the back. The door buzzed, heavy metal bars sliding open with a mechanical whine. The moment Elijah stepped inside, the door clanged shut behind him. Cold. That was his first thought. The cinder block walls radiated an icy chill, the metal bench beneath him offering no comfort. The fluorescent lights hummed, flickering slightly, casting long shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. He sat, hands resting on his knees, his mind calculating, strategizing. He wasn't alone. The other men in the cell, a mix of exhausted faces, some slumped in the corners, others watching warily, took him in with cautious glances. One of them, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, gave him a long, considering look. "What they get you for?" the man finally asked. Elijah exhaled, the heat of frustration pressing against his ribs. "Existing in the wrong place at the wrong time." The man huffed a humorless laugh. "Yeah, that sounds about right." The cell fell into silence again, heavy with unspoken truths. Elijah leaned back against the cold, cinder-block wall, forcing his breathing to stay even. Then he closed his eyes and listened. The station was alive with movement, phones ringing, officers murmuring, the occasional burst of laughter from somewhere down the hall, and then something different, the quick clipped sound of high heels striking tile, a voice, sharp and commanding. Elijah opened his eyes, tension coiling in his gut. His assistant had seen everything, and she had already called his company's legal team. They were coming. 2 hours later, the heavy steel door of the interrogation room groaned open, and Officer Darren McCall strutted inside like a man arriving to collect his winnings. In his hand, a steaming cup of coffee rested comfortably, his fingers curled around it with the confidence of someone who thought he had already won. Elijah Carter sat at the metal table, wrists still bound, his expression unreadable. The room was sterile, painted in muted grays, the kind of place designed to make a man feel small. But Elijah didn't feel small. He had spent the last 2 hours not in fear, but in calculation. McCall took a slow sip of his coffee, then exhaled with exaggerated satisfaction. "Bad news," he said, his smirk widening. "Surveillance footage is missing for the time of the robbery. Guess you'll be here a while." Elijah's fingers curled under the table, but his expression didn't change. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what this was. Footage doesn't just go missing. McCall had buried it, or made sure it was buried. This was a game, a power move, an attempt to break him before the legal system could correct the mistake. McCall leaned in, placing his cup on the table with a soft clink. "I gotta say, for a guy who thinks he's so damn important, you sure don't have many friends in here." Elijah inhaled slowly, steady. McCall wanted a reaction. He wouldn't get one. But before Elijah could respond, the door to the interrogation room burst open so hard it slammed against the wall with a sharp, echoing crack. "Not another word." The voice was like a knife through the room, precise, sharp, commanding. A woman in a perfectly tailored gray suit stepped in, the air shifting with her presence. Sarah Coleman. McCall's smirk froze, his body stiffening at the sight of her. Behind her, a man followed. Broad-shouldered, older, his uniform crisp, his expression dark with something between fury and disappointment. Captain James Holloway. Elijah exhaled silently. Right on time. Sarah's eyes flicked to Elijah's cuffs, then back to McCall. "Release my client, now." She didn't raise her voice, but the authority in it filled the room. She wasn't making a request. She was giving an order. McCall let out a breathy laugh, a weak attempt at maintaining control. "We're in the middle of an investigation." Sarah didn't give him the courtesy of a response. Instead, she moved to the table, pulling a thick folder from her briefcase and slamming it down in front of Captain Holloway. The impact echoed, sending a chill through the already tense space. Holloway opened it, his jaw tightening as he flipped through the contents. His eyes moved fast, too fast for McCall to try and talk his way out of this. Inside was everything. Elijah's alibi, security footage from his company's own cameras, time-stamped records proving exactly where he was at the moment of the alleged robbery, and then the nail in the coffin. A signed report. McCall's own statement from earlier in the evening claiming Elijah fit the suspect's description. Next to it, the actual suspect's description, different height, different build, different clothing. Holloway's grip on the folder tightened. He lifted his gaze, his voice a low growl. "You tampered with evidence, McCall?" McCall paled instantly. His throat bobbed. For the first time since this started, the arrogance was gone. He looked from Holloway to Sarah, then back to Elijah, whose expression remained cool, unreadable. "I didn't—" McCall started, but Holloway cut him off. "You're suspended. Get out of my station." The words landed like a gunshot. Silence. McCall's lips parted, his body rigid, as if his brain hadn't fully processed what had just happened. "Wait, Now." Holloway's voice was like iron. McCall hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for everyone in the room to see it. The power shift, the humiliation creeping up his spine. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, his steps slower than before, his confidence shattered. A sharp, clipped sound filled the room as Sarah nodded to the officer standing by the door. The cuffs snapped open, and Elijah stood, rolling his wrists to shake off the weight of the injustice that had bound him. For the first time, McCall understood. He had messed with the wrong man. The next morning, Elijah Carter's face was everywhere. His arrest had been humiliating, but now it was a symbol. News outlets were running the footage nonstop. National networks, business channels, social media platforms. His name was trending worldwide. "CEO wrongfully arrested by rogue officer. Legal team strikes back." False arrest of black CEO sparks outrage. Investigation launched against Officer McCall. You fit the description. How one officer's abuse of power backfired. Elijah sat in his office, his hands steepled in front of him as his team updated him. His assistant spoke rapidly, reading from a tablet, her voice laced with urgency. "McCall is under internal investigation, officially suspended. The department's PR team is scrambling. Damage control is in full swing. Civil rights organizations are already involved. The NAACP issued a statement. Protest groups are mobilizing. Everyone wants a comment." Elijah exhaled, his mind sharp, calculating. This wasn't just about him anymore. His arrest had exposed something raw, something undeniable. People weren't just outraged because it had happened to him. They were outraged because it happened all the time to people who didn't have his resources, his platform, his ability to fight back. His phone buzzed. A call from an unknown number. His assistant glanced at the screen. "Press?" He nodded. She tapped the screen, connecting the call. "Elijah Carter?" The voice belonged to a reporter, the tone professional but eager. "Your story has taken over the headlines. People are looking to you for a response. What do you want to say to the world?" Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on the sleek black surface of his desk. Outside his office windows, the skyline stretched in all directions, a reminder of how far he had come, how much he had built, how much more there was to do. "I want change," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. "And I won't stop until we see it." The words hit the airwaves within minutes. Social media erupted. The support was overwhelming. Messages poured in, CEOs, Politicians, activists, everyday people who had experienced their own versions of what happened to him. Hashtags exploded across platforms. Justice for Elijah Shar Yu. Fit the description. End police abuse. People weren't just talking about McCall anymore. They were sharing their own stories, their own experiences. His name was a lightning rod now, a rallying cry for something bigger than just his personal vindication. McCall had thought he was powerful, but he had just handed real power to the man he tried to bring down. Justice wasn't just restored, it was amplified.